don't know anything about politics, but I know something about VW. It was a great win.
Yes, exactly, yes. Housekeeping announcements. I've got clock on the presentation, yeah. Finished by 11:30, yeah?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Q3 Quarter Economic Breakfast meeting here at Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. And I'd like to welcome you all to Elliott House. A lot of familiar faces and some brand new faces as well today. So welcome to our event. Just before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping notices. There's no fire alarms, drills, etc. expected today. So if anything does go off, it is some form of emergency or some incident or something or other. We just use the fire exits, the staff are on hand. We'll meet just outside here on Jackson's Road, but there's no test expected. Facilities are just through in the members' lounge as well for gentlemen and ladies. This morning is great. It's great to see so many people here, and we're doing a number of things for the first time here today. We are going to be streaming this live. We are streaming this live on YouTube, courtesy of Crew of a Few Productions. The camera's there at the back. And there will be a link that's been tweeted out to you, so those on Twitter. Why you'd want to watch it while you're live in the room, I don't know. But people outside the room will be able to watch what's going on, so just be aware of that.
Tell us what it is, the link.
Joe, where's Joe? Can you just copy the? It's a long link. It is a long link. If you tweet it out, if I was on Twitter, you'll be able to pick it up off Twitter.
Right.
There is a link to it off the tweet.
Okay.
But if I stand here going www./ we'll be here till half 10. But you will get access to it. The other thing is we've got Manchester Business Radio with us this morning as well. Those of you that may be aware of that, Manchester Business Radio, a DAB station, went live on Monday. It's the UK's first and only business talk radio station, and we've been a great supporter of it here at the Chamber of Commerce. And John and David are here with us today. They've got a couple of people lined up already to do some interviews afterwards, but we'll also be walking around the members' lounge afterwards while the network is taking place to find out other views from members about what you've heard today from the Quarter Economic Breakfast. So welcome to Manchester Business Radio. Just going back to Twitter, if you want to tweet about this, then the hashtag is GMCC QES. We're also asking for questions from people outside, so if anything comes in on that, I'm monitoring what's going on there, so there may be something there which we'll ask Christine about later on. I'll do a bit of filtering, Christine, so don't worry. No nasty curveballs with that one. Just around the QES, I think it's quite important that we just reflect on where we've gone over the last 2 or 3 years with it. Going back to when Brian Sloan was our chief economist, we had John Ashcroft for the last couple of years. And what we've always wanted to do is evolve the QES into something that becomes that real centrepiece for economic research and business information within Greater Manchester. And it's been a route that we've gone down over the last couple of years. And John did a great job for the last 2 years as our chief economist. His contract ended in July, and we're moving on now to the next stage in its development. So it gives me absolute pleasure to ask Christine Spence, our Head of Policy and Research, to come and give his first quarter economic breakfast on the Q3 results from the Chamber's QES survey. Christian.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice, thank you. Very nice to be here. A great opportunity for me. It's a great pleasure to be leading now on the results of our latest economic survey for the third quarter. I guess just a bit of an intro. We'll just sort of set the scene. The quarterly economic survey is hugely important to us. It sits at the core of all of our economic and research gathering. It gives us an insight into the GM economy which no other research house has. It is crucially important. Hopefully here all of you know exactly what it is. Hopefully you are all regular contributors. If you're not, we'll be sort of debriefing you on the way out and making sure you engage in future. But the importance of it isn't just, we don't do economic research here for the sake of being good economists. That's not what we do. The whole purpose of gathering data, either officially through bodies like the Office of National Statistics, or through primary research like the QES, is so that we know better what is going on, so that we can tell you better what is going on. This is not for internal pride or managing our own sort of expectations. It is about helping you. So the QES sits not only at the heart of days like this, when we'll feed the results back, what you and your colleagues in the Greater Manchester business community are saying, but it sits at the heart of all of our policy work and our campaigning work as well. This is usually the single largest primary bit of evidence we use in submissions to local government and national government when they're consulting on major bits of policy changes. So it is hugely important. It's not just a piece of research that sits on the back end of all of our analytics servers. It's hugely useful, and the idea is it changes the business environment for the better for you and allows us to get all of the information from you, which allows us to shout to the people in power and say, great stuff, keep going what you're doing, or what the hell are you thinking? And here's the evidence to support why we say you're wrong. So that's the important thing. So just a little bit more about the QES, and then we'll move into the numbers itself. We boast about it because it's great. It's not just a great tool of ours. It is, across the UK, it's run by British Chambers of Commerce. It is the largest, the most reliable business confidence survey. It's quickly published. You'll notice we are the only body now publishing Q3 data in Q3. Q3 doesn't end until next Wednesday, but we're pretty certain we've got a good grasp on things. And it's used by key policymakers routinely and is quoted by them in all of their documents. The size does matter. Yes, it does. Between 7,000 and 8,000 responses nationally. Compare that to other business organisations who've published research earlier this week from about 470 on a national body. It gives a huge granularity to what we understand. We are looking at high-level indicators, but because we look at high-level indicators across such a very large sample size, we're able to drill down and infer and understand a lot more information from that. It is also incredibly reliable. It has predicted both of the recessions since the survey began. It goes back to about 1989 in its high-level data. I've said it's first, and it is routinely quoted. I was down with the Bank of England monetary analytics team yesterday, going through all of these results. So the people who advise the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England talk to the Chambers of Commerce every single quarter. They get all the headline data, and then they talk to people like me and around the network in terms of how do you see it, what's going on regionally, how is the business world different in Manchester from how it's different to the rest of the UK. And also, I come into contact with a lot of you. I've spoken to 500 or 600 of you over the past 2 or 3 months at the Action for Business events. That's a great opportunity for us to feed back the information you give us, whether anecdotal or real, directly to bodies like the MPC and the bank. And certainly if you read all of the main economic bulletins from people like the EU and the OECD, you will always see in there British Chambers of Commerce, QES, as being a key indicator. So what you tell us matters. And what you tell us broadly is we ask you about 6 key things. I may well be preaching to the converted for those of you who do this regularly, but for those who don't, it's worth revisiting it. We ask about 18 high-level questions, business sentiment indications around your UK performance for your company, your international performance if you are an exporter, what's going on in terms of recruitment demand, what's going on in terms of employment and recruitment difficulties, what's happening in terms of your broad confidence environment for the coming 6 and 12 months, what's happening around investment, not only what we might call productive capacity around plant and machinery investment, but also in terms of human capital and what's happening in terms of how you're investing in your own staff. And then some of the wider macroeconomic issues around just broad costs and prices. Are you seeing inflationary pressures? Are there bits in your business where costs are starting to bite? And then some of the much more wider external issues which are starting to come up on your radar. That's the kind of stuff we gather, and with an awful lot of hard work in the background, we're able to feed all that back to you. So, without further ado, off we go. One of the great things we've developed over the past couple of years, and with huge thanks to John Ashcroft, is what we call the Manchester Index. It is essentially a distillation of a number of key QES indicators, those which correlate most tightly with the UK economy, and essentially it distills those spreadsheets and spreadsheets of data which we trawl through for the QES down into a single number, something nice and easy to get hold of, which gives you an indication of where the UK economy is. And the green line there, Manchester Index, we are now showing for Q3, tracking about 31. Down slightly over the past couple of quarters, softening of UK demand since the end of 2014. We don't see that as a concern. We see that primarily as a normal easing back from a catch-up economic recovery. It's quite standard practice in a recession. We see demand fall, as you can see there in 2009. There's usually a bit of an economic catch-up as we come out of recession. So a little bit more activity, some of that displaced activity from the period of recession plays catch-up. We saw the economy ease back slightly in the early stages of the last Parliament. Some of those particular government austerity, particularly government spending plans around capital investment, hit economic growth in the early stage of the last Parliament. Osborne was talked to fairly firmly on stuff like that, saying actually capital investment is fairly key. Whilst we understand the broad macro environment, whilst we understand the need for what we would call fiscal consolidation, trying to lower the overall government spending deficit, capital investment is where your future growth will come from. And if you stop investing in capital, you will diminish your future returns. And that is essentially that lower period of growth we saw in 2011 and 2012. He heeded the call late, but thankfully we've seen greater capital spending since then. We've seen some significant investment in some larger infrastructure projects, some of which are now beginning to be physically visible. And there was a huge turning point in the UK economy early in 2013. Big part of catch-up there, just over 3% growth over 2013, easing back slightly. So we would say, on the whole, we're pretty confident for the UK economy at the moment. We are certainly clear now from your data, and official data is playing catch-up with us, that Greater Manchester is now outpacing the national average. GM is growing at about 4.5% a year on its own now in the latest data. So we are seeing the gap, as it were, between the national average of economic growth and Greater Manchester's economic growth narrow, and that is an excellent thing. In terms of what that means for going forward, British Chambers of Commerce last week published their own economic forecast for the coming years. They're expecting growth of around 2.6% this year now, upgraded from 2.3, rising slightly to 2.7 over the next couple of years. We would broadly agree with that, but we think they're still slightly negative, particularly for this year. I'll come on to exactly why that is, but it's mostly around construction data later on. But for now, we're slightly more bullish, and we're predicting growth of about 2.8% we think we'll post, 2.7, 2.8 for this year, and probably softening to about 2.7 going forward. Okay, so that's your headline data. That's how we aggregate all of the QES. We'll now spend a little time diving into a little bit more of the detail. So the things we ask you particularly about are around your sales and your orders for different sectors. You'll see there a softening in the sales measures. The Manchester Index picks that up by just easing back. The critical thing here, though, is to see this softening, as I said, as an easing back from a period of high growth post-economic recovery. That's absolutely fine. And the key thing on the charts here is compare where we are now to some of those pre-recession levels in 2005, 2006, 2007. Yeah, we're easing back, but we are still above some of the measures we were reporting when the world was a very different place about 10 years ago. Manufacturing orders, we critically ask about order books and your intentions for over the next 3 months, so what you're seeing in terms of activity from now through until Christmas. Bit of a softening in the manufacturing measure, and that is a slight concern. We've seen a weakening in manufacturing growth more generally over the past 9 months or so. Manufacturing had a very good 2014. It's easing back this year so far, and if the indications are true, then we would expect to see that easing back even more so as we go towards the end of the year and into 2016. It's not yet really clear what's causing that. Certainly manufacturing is more exposed to global pressures in the UK than the service sector is. A greater share of the manufacturing industry exports compared to the service sector, and a greater share of the manufacturing supply chain is focused in a small number of very large global companies. And so a change in investment by 3, 4, 5 very large scale international manufacturing companies can have significant effects in the supply chain. So we're not quite certain. We'll be monitoring that over the next 3 or 6 months, but we'll take things from there. What has been historically one of the issues with the QES is we lump the entire economy down into these 2 separate streams, manufacturing and services. Services is hugely dominant. Just under 80% of the UK economy sits within the service sector. And we group all the rest under manufacturing in the QES, which isn't necessarily helpful, because actually that index there for manufacturing covers production industries, so extraction, mining, utilities, and then what we might call core manufacturing, the true manufacturing business. And it also contains construction, because essentially it needs to go somewhere, and historically the QES has never separated the two. That causes some difficulty in helping us to understand exactly what's going on with manufacturing, because particularly at the moment, construction is undergoing somewhat of a fairly serious boom. A walk around Manchester now, looking up at the number of cranes, will show you the sheer activity that's going on in terms of particularly private commercial investment here in the city centre. Manchester is now down to about 12 months of grade 1 office space supply at current take-up rates, which is having some fairly significant impacts on rental commercial yields. We're also seeing, of course, some great activity in the infrastructure projects. There's work going on around us for a lot of the Northern Hub projects on the rail. Victoria Station has very nearly now completed its wholesale rebuilding. So there's a lot of work going on in that infrastructure section, and this is really driving construction. And even though it's still relatively small at this stage, we're starting to see housing development start to pick up. There's a long way to go. There's a huge number of complex issues in there. Access to capital for the construction sector itself. Banks are still feeling overexposed to the wider construction sector from some of the issues hung over from the recession of 2008, and they're still unwilling to lend, and access to land supply is always an issue for housing, and sadly we don't see that going away anytime soon. So those issues just kind of blur this manufacturing picture that we look at in the headline data. So what we've been able to do, we've done a lot of work on trying to disaggregate all this and say, actually, is it possible over the last few years to be able to separate what we might call core manufacturing from what's going on in the construction sector? And delighted to say, yes, we can. So what you're seeing there now, the same thing for sales and orders. The dotted green line is what was our old manufacturing measure, which lumps everything which isn't services together, and then separates core manufacturing in the green line and the construction sector in white. And all of a sudden that gives you a very different picture about what's going on within those industries. Construction had a torrid time post-recession. The nature of construction means we always tend to say it's first in, first out of recession. It's where capital spending is immediately reined in at any kind of economic recession period. So you see that very weak growth for the construction sector in 2010, 2011. Bit of a boost late 2011. That's mostly caused by, as it were, a late chunk of public investment spending by the Labour government pre-2010, which fed through. So we saw quite a lot of PFI projects, of housing projects, of school rebuilds, which were delivered late in that parliament, which were announced late in that parliament, and then delivered into 2011. And that gave the construction sector a little bit of a lift, but it very quickly fell back into recession again in 2012. What we have seen, though, is that stark change in performance over the last two years or so. Construction is doing really, really well on the whole. We are working at figures of around 4 to 4.5% growth for the construction sector this year. We expect it is likely to soften very slightly into 2016, but nothing of any concern. But the construction sector is growing and growing quickly. And that has some huge challenges for the sector itself, because its supply chain is not yet ready to deliver on a lot of those projects. Access to skilled labour for the construction sector is immensely tight, and we'll talk about what that's having on the impact that's having on labour demand a little later. But what that does highlight, because construction is actually so strong within that overall measure, what you do see actually is a clearer picture of the coming weakness within the manufacturing industry in Greater Manchester. So manufacturing recovered actually very quickly after the recession and the recovery into 2010. Decent 2.5%, 3% growth even for aspects of manufacturing then. Bit of an ease back. It's picked up relatively well in late 2013, but we are seeing a significant slowdown. I said, at the moment, it really is not clear what that is. Some people are talking, manufacturing always talks about exchange rates as being a particular issue because of the sheer scale of export and import that goes on in there. To sort of caveat that, I'd say, sort of slightly light-heartedly, but also slightly seriously, we do tend to find the exporting manufacturing sector always complains whether exchange rate, they complain about a strong pound and they complain about a weak pound. Because most of them are importers and exporters. Raw materials coming in. You know, we're not a manufacturing nation, we're a creative nation. We don't have the raw materials here. They're all imported. So a strong pound gives you problems on the export side and the prices that you sell at. A weak pound gives you problems on increasing import prices to feed all those. So it's a difficult time. So the one look at for us now is trying to keep an eye on that manufacturing sector over the next 3 or 6 months and try to understand what's going on. But certainly for the moment, the forecasts are for easing growth in the end of this year and into 2016. So we'll step out to the QES and just have a look at some official data from the ONS, which helps to support some of this. The left-hand chart there is what we call the index of production. So that's the whole part of the UK economy which is neither services nor construction. So that's your mining, extractive industries, utilities, electricity, gas and water, and then you have separately in white your manufacturing. And a lot of talk has been put recently, the official data is recording manufacturing, or production generally, as being very weak. You see in that disaggregation, if you separate the manufacturing element out, manufacturing is performing better than wider construction, wider production industry. So be careful when you read data like this. So often when people talk about manufacturing output, they're actually referring to production output, which means you've got manufacturing and extraction. And the two have very, very different outlooks. And the chart on the right shows you some of that in more detail. The white line there is your core manufacturing sector, as it might be, still not recovered fully from the recession. Output is still below its pre-recession high in 2008. But there is one thing that's dragging the production measure down, and that is mining, quarrying and extraction. You see there, it has lost nearly 50% of output over the past 10 years. Most of that is driven by increasing declines of output from North Sea oil and gas. Extraction rates there are now falling by between 20 and 30% a year on year. The gas that is there is increasingly hard to get at, and it costs $40, $45, $50 a barrel to physically get gas out of the North Sea, and that's only going to increase. Now that's a huge challenge, because this morning oil on both its measures, West Texas and on Brent, is trading sub 50. So there's a big problem for the wider oil and gas sector about whether they can physically make money extracting from the North Sea. And very much they are now gambling on a reasonably certain increase, a reasonably strong increase in oil prices as we move later into this year and into 2016. The markets are open as to whether that will happen. Forecasts for oil prices at the end of the year vary widely from $40 to about $90 a barrel. Nobody has ever predicted the oil market particularly successfully. It's very hard to work out what's going on, but that is a big challenge for that wider production sector. $40 a barrel to get out of the North Sea. The Middle East can extract it for about $6 or $7 a barrel. So there's some huge challenges. And this sort of plays into the big political debate around whether we can become more sufficient with forms of energy like shale gas. Okay, back to the QES and looking at the service sector. As I said, dominant in the UK economy, about 80% of all of our overall output, and the survey data is pretty conclusive. Things are looking very, very good. Again, an ease back. That's an ease back from a record high. We've not seen levels, the levels we saw 3 quarters ago, we've not seen in nearly 30 years of survey. So incredibly strong recovery from the service sector. Yes, it's eased back, but it's easing back to growth rates commensurate of about 4% a year. So we wouldn't say that is slow in any way at all. So service sector is looking healthy. It's certainly being driven by a small number of sectors who are dominating in there. Logistics is seeing some very, very strong performance, particularly here in Greater Manchester and the North West. Greater Manchester anyway is a great centre of logistics hubs. The developments at Liverpool Superport, developing the new post-Panamax deepwater port there, are only likely to increase that logistics support here in Greater Manchester and the wider region. Certainly that also plays into political arguments about HS2 and about how we essentially give capacity on the rail network for all the containers which will now, in the future, be being dropped at Liverpool rather than at the deepwater ports in Southampton or Felixstowe. I'm just going to break down again, like we did with the index of production, into index of services. So the chart on the left is the ONS's output figures for the whole service sector. You'll see this is the one that is driving the UK recovery. Output is already just under 10% higher than it was in its pre-recession peak in 2008. And again, so some sectors driving that particularly. You see there the dark green line, the solid green line, I should say, in the chart on the right is distribution. It's also hotels and restaurants, which are seeing a phenomenally good trade. Here in Greater Manchester, the number of rooms we have here is growing at an astonishing rate. We've more than doubled our hotel rooms in the last 10 years and maintained occupancy rates level throughout all of that. Tourism is a massive part of the Greater Manchester economy, about £6 billion a year, all in all. And we are now actually in England, second only to London, in the UK, third only to Edinburgh, but we are forecast to overtake Edinburgh in the next year or two as an international and national tourist destination. So a phenomenal amount of money available in that area. Huge drive to particularly the core urban centre here in Manchester over to Salford Quays and Trafford, but that has an enormous ripple effect, not only across Greater Manchester, but across the wider north. With facilities like Manchester Airport, we are the natural gateway to the north of England. And that essentially, that increased connectivity, new direct flights from both the United States and from Southeast Asia is just increasing Manchester's visibility as a clear tourist destination. And even if that money is not spent here, those people pass through Manchester on the way to wherever they're going in the north. Other growth areas, not surprisingly, finance and professional services is continuing to perform well. There's still a lot of shakedown going on. People talk about, the financial sector and everything has sort of fully recovered from the 2008 recession. There's still some job shedding going on. There's still a huge amount of restructuring going on within finance, within legal, within professional services. Within the banking sector, that's being particularly driven by regulatory changes. So banks are finding they're having to restructure their staff. So often headcounts might be neutral, but there's still a lot of rejiggling and job changes going in within all of that. And the legal sector is undergoing some fairly phenomenal changes. The Legal Services Act is still playing its way through that sector, and we expect over the medium term there's going to be some significant changes, particularly for mid-tier firms. We've seen quite a lot of legal mergers over the past 2 or 3 years. A lot of those is in response to some of those changes. Broadly, the outlook for all of those sectors is certainly positive, but they are undergoing some significant changes. And the only thing really dragging down the services index is that dotted white line at the bottom, which is what we call the other bits, really. They're the 4 last sectors in the service distribution: education, health, Wider social environment, arts, recreation, that's essentially public sector cuts and the deficit strategy of both the previous and current governments, keeping a weight down on the rate of growth of public spending, which is just keeping that service level down. But the fact that services is growing at around 4.5% a year, despite year-on-year cuts to about 20% of the economy, is a great testament. A huge part of that is retail. Now, we've had a lot of talk since the recovery that we are seeing a consumer-led recovery, an unbalanced recovery. The recovery is far too driven by consumer spending and not by investment. We tend to pour a little bit of cold water on that because the consumer is fundamentally the engine of any economy. Every transaction you make, even if you're a B2B supplier, business-to-business supplier, the business you supply to may be a business-to-business supplier, but at the end of that chain is a consumer, no matter what it is you do. And you cannot have an economic recovery without consumer spending, certainly not in a major first world Western economy. About 2/3 of the UK economy is fundamentally consumer spending driven. That's not unusual for the UK, it's not unusual across all OECD countries. So we don't worry about that particularly. And what we have seen since, again, the change we saw in the economy about 2.5 years ago in early 2013 was a massive regaining of confidence within the consumer environment. So you see on the chart on the left there, the white line actually is the important one for what we're talking about. That's the volume of retail sales. So take prices out of it for a moment. This is just the physical amount of stuff that is sold. Flat for nearly 5 years, nearly 6 years, post-recession, and then a huge turnaround, I said, about 2 years ago. And that is continuing to grow and grow very strongly. Consumers clearly are finding access to money. So yes, we are seeing unsecured lending start to improve. And of course, interest rates are relatively low, even for unsecured lending. So that is helping to pass through some of that. And particularly in the last 3 or 6 months, we're starting to see pay rates start to move. So the consumer feels wealthier, they feel more able to spend. And the flip side of that is the green line, which is prices. So the amount of money spent in the retail sector, you can see there in the last 3 months or so is basically flat. So essentially prices in the retail sector are falling. We've got some deflation in that sector particularly. That is also helping to drive consumer growth. Essentially we can buy more things for the same amount of money. And that is, by the nature of retail, it's very good for the retail environment as a whole, but all of that will immediately flow through into the wholesale environment and then into the manufacturing environment, and logistics and distribution will all benefit more widely. I think it's also worth talking on retail sales about, we've heard a lot about a retail crisis, really post-recession, and that's been focused on the narrative of the high street. We've seen shop vacancy rates post-recession leap very strongly. They are now coming down, but that recovery is not evenly spread. Core urban environments, what we might call primary tier, first tier urban city centres, are performing extremely well, and at least as well as they've performed even pre-recession in 2008. Manchester city centre, its retail sales are growing about 7.5% a year. Trafford Centre is posting some very strong performance. Other centres, the big centres at Oxford Street, in Birmingham city centre, are also performing extremely well. We're also seeing some very strong demand from what we might call tertiary centres, district centres. In Manchester, in looking at places like Didsbury or Chorlton, further afield in smaller villages like Ramsbottom, where the consumer gets a highly personalised, local, almost sort of a valued experience from a gut level sense, they are also performing well. What is being squeezed are the secondaries, the places like the major town centres outside of the city centres. They are feeling the squeeze because primarily the way that consumers interact with retail has changed. The line we've often used in reports here is that retail is no longer a refuel and restock process, but it's embedded in a much more wider cultural offer. We talk about destination shopping. People don't come to Manchester necessarily just to buy what it is they need and then go home. It is about coming for retail and for restaurants or hotels or wider tourism, arts, culture, a place to meet, a place to do things. And that changing consumer environment is having an impact. The flip, I said, is that smaller district centres who can give you something unique can do very well. Large urban centres which can offer that breadth of offer that's not just retail, but a much wider consumer and visitor offer are also doing well. It's the places in between. So I think the message from this is, from the macro point of view, retail has no crisis. You can see it in the figures. The spending is strong, the future forecasts are strong, the sector is performing well. It doesn't mean it's not under pressure, it's under huge competitive pressure. Price competition has not been higher for many years within retail. But the problem is a micro one, not a macro one. The challenge is for those secondary town centres how they respond. How do you provide that breadth of offer to be able to challenge some of the major ones? And if you can't provide the breadth, then the question is, what is your specialty? Can you offer something unique? Can you offer something different to what's going on around you? And if you can, you will thrive. And some of the secondary town centres in Greater Manchester are doing very well at that. Some aren't. Diving a bit more into the detail, the right-hand chart just splits retail down, and you can see how some of these things are changing. You'll notice there is one enormous outlier on that chart. The white spiky line is, it's technically, we call it mail order, but it's basically internet sales. Growing 10% a year, year on year, for nearly the past decade, with those huge spikes are November and December figures, not surprisingly for Christmas shopping. This is one of the other things that's a challenge to the high street. Now, most companies who are doing well in this area, who are playing both the clicks and the bricks game, say it is not about either or. It's about how you complement those two. It's about how you allow customers to come in store and still experience a digital experience. It's also about how you can order online but pick up in store and then have a very good personal service delivered to you while you're there, the ability to upsell separate things. So again, we would say, yes, the retail sector is under pressures, it's under some very certain challenges, but it is doing very, very well. And those businesses which are flight of foot and are well managed and have good processes in place are reaping the benefits of that. Okay, that's as much as we're going to dive into on the major UK stuff. Let's move into international, a much more complex area. So in the same way for the UK, in the QES for international as well, we look at services, at sales and orders for the major sectors. You'll see there a bit of a weakening off in the service sector this quarter for international exports. Order books also for the service sector slightly weaker. But broadly, everything is around its long-term trend. Within the QES data, the international exporting data is very, very volatile. You'll see that compared to some of the slides we saw earlier. It's a much noisier chart. There's an awful lot of issues to try and see through in the international sector. It's not as simple as it is with the UK economy. But broadly, as I said, we tend to try and look at this thing in trends rather than individual movements every quarter. Yes, we've seen an ease back in services, but broadly, as I said, we're around the historic growth marks. It's a bit punishing out there. There are some countries doing extremely well. There are others who are still highly constrained. Global trade is still weak by historic standards, still only about 3.5–4% a year in terms of overall volume of global trade. Our major trading partner, the EU, is growing again now, but it's still fairly stunted. And it's really very much a case of this will be a very different experience for different companies. If businesses don't trade with countries, they trade with other companies. So you can have very strong companies in very weak economies and very weak companies in very strong economies. So you can't look at global macro growth as one chunk. Companies who trade in Germany will be having a variety of experiences, particularly if you're in automotive supply at the moment. And vice versa with trading in places like Greece. There are still huge opportunities available, even if the macro conditions are not necessarily very good. So always be careful with international data. It is enormously volatile. And just to show you this, this is our balance of trade for the UK. So on the top half of that graph is our trade balance in services. On the bottom of the graph is our trade balance in goods, and the black line in the middle there is the overall. So people always go on about the trade deficit in the UK. It's a nightmare. We've always imported more than we've exported. And we have for a very, very long time. And you see there, the trend is going nowhere. We don't expect the trade deficit to close. It's only sitting about 2–2.5% of GDP. It's easily fundable. It's not a large amount of money. I mean, 100 billion is a large amount of money, but within the UK economy, 100 billion is not a large amount of money. And it is clear the growth is going to come from services. It is as our architecture firms, as our professional services firms, as our retail firms look abroad for opportunities to sell, that we will expect to see our trade balance recover. The issue with the goods sector, as I said, is in the export of goods, and from the manufacturing point of view, is we do not in this country hold most of our raw materials. So every time you want to export a widget, you have to import a huge chunk of bits of things which make up a widget. The value add in manufacturing is the processing here, not the creating from raw materials on firm. So every time you export something, you have to import for most cases. The numbers are really hard to get at, but the best we can come to is we reckon for every pound of exports, we need to import between 60 and 70 pence of raw materials. That is our metals, that is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So actually this idea of chasing, the government announced its fantastic round number target. We will have £1 trillion worth of exports from this economy by 2020. Utter guff. It's just not possible. Do the numbers, it doesn't work. If you can't chase. We also hear figures like if only 20% more of our firms exported than do now, then we would close the trade gap. You wouldn't, because for everyone that exports another pound, you suck in another chunk of imports. And this is the nature of a major Western economy. When UK demand rises, so when our economy recovers, what happens is we suck in more imports to feed our own consumer desires. Our export volumes are much more predicated on global demand, where our import volumes are predicated on UK demand. And that's the flip. And this thing is not so easy as an awful lot of commentators would have you believe. Okay, we're just going to dive into a little bit more detail. This is a very complex chart. It might be hard to read, but take away from this the trends, please, rather than any of the granular detail. This is the data from HMRC on regional trade. So this is imports and exports from the northwest by either source country if it's an import or destination country if it's an export. Not surprisingly, the overwhelming volume of our trade is with the EU, though it is falling. 10 years ago, about 55% of our exports and our trade overall was with the EU. That's now about 47, 46%, and falling. That is both weakness within the EU market, but also the UK is actively seeking international markets a little more healthily. But the overall trend there is, look, there is no big rise in exports. We are not pushing this idea that with this huge growth in exports in the UK. It isn't happening. Now, the Northwest is more dependent on 2 or 3 commodities than other parts of the UK. And if we take a look at that same data by commodity now, rather than destination, you'll see the big one there, Northwest exports, that sort of rather nice peachy colour in the middle, is chemicals. We're heavily reliant in the Northwest on chemicals. The other big one, the dark red line, is machinery and transport. And anything to do with the chemicals industry, with oils, with fuels and lubricants, is a highly volatile market, and will respond very quickly to changes in global supply and global demand. And so you will see a lot of noise in the data, and certainly from an export point of view here, we are highly dependent on 2 or 3 big global markets and on 2 or 3 well-developed particular commodities. And all of those things are very volatile. So I don't want you to come out of this with a pessimistic view on exports, that we are we're a nightmare. We are a big trading nation. We always have been. We continue to be. We will continue to get smaller as a share of UK global trade because other very poor countries are becoming rich, and that is a thing to celebrate. We will become a smaller share of the global economy because other people are managing to catch us up. That's very good for the people in those countries, and it's also very good for us because there is nothing like a bit of healthy competition to make sure we stay on top. Okay, back to the QES survey, and let's look at some labour market. So, broadly, again, you see the shape of the recovery here. This is the questions here are: has the number of people you employ increased or decreased this quarter for the green lines, and are your expectations for the level of employment in your company increasing or decreasing in the right-hand chart for the next quarter. So you see actually some incredibly volatile numbers in manufacturing employment over the past year or two, which fits with the volatility we've seen within the manufacturing sector earlier on. We were talking at the Bank of England yesterday. They were probing us quite hard on why we are seeing strong manufacturing employment figures and strong manufacturing recruitment figures against an outlook of declining growth, not declining manufacturing, but a rate of growth which is slowing. And of course the big thing that stands out in manufacturing as against a lot of the service sector is the age distribution of the workforce. So the average age in the manufacturing sector, and the higher skilled you get, the more true it is increasingly over 50. For some sectors it's over 55, and for chemical engineers within the Northwest it's 62. That has got some huge issues in terms of skills pressures going forward for the industry and how it is going to react to that. But what it does mean is you've actually got a very high level of churn at the moment. You are losing employees at the top end, and even if your business is not growing, even if you don't expect particularly to be selling more things next year than you are this year, you're having to replace your current workforce because simply they're retiring. So even though the outlook for manufacturing output is weaker this year and into next year than we saw, say, 12 months ago, our expectations for employment and recruitment within the manufacturing sector remain strong. Again, some of that volatility in the manufacturing number there is caused by extremely strong employment within the construction sector. I've not split it out on every chart because we'll all go a bit chart blind if I go into too much detail. But certainly recruitment within the construction sector is extremely strong. Pay rates within the construction sector, particularly bonus pay rates in the construction sector, are running at astronomical levels. We've seen 2 or 3 months in the past half year of bonus rates of 20–25% increase year on year. And working with the rail industry leaders group, which we do here, if you talk to some of the very specialist technical terms within rail, there are some firms there that are currently reporting 75% year-on-year pay increases for skilled labour, and one firm has said they've had to pay 75% year-on-year for 3 years. That can only play out in one way, probably by me moving to becoming a rail technician. But there is some volatility, but so actually because of, within the manufacturing sector, because of this issue of an ageing workforce, even though demand remains weaker than we've seen before, employment intentions are staying high. Service sector, a bit of a turn down, but we see here for a slightly different reason. This now appears to be essentially the drive in pay rates. So from a big macro view at the service sector, we are running out of available labour. So unemployment rates across the UK are down to about nearly 5.5% now. They're falling extremely quickly. The available pool of labour is shrinking, and that, at last, I have to say, we here have been commenting for 2 years, saying we expect the pay rates to pick up next month. We've been saying that constantly. At last, that has finally gained ground, and we're seeing pay rates rising just under 3% nationally. We'll pick that up later in some of the labour market stuff. So this is a challenge for the service sector. The available pool of labour is getting smaller because most are in work. And even though there is an unemployment pool there to draw on, the big challenge for business is, are they the right people? Have they got the right skills? Are they in the right place? Can they move around? And that is the heart of, for us, what the Chancellor should be focusing on within his Northern Powerhouse. If the Northern Powerhouse does not deliver significantly improved infrastructure and communications, which allows the labour force across the major northern cities, which is greater than that of Greater London, to interact, move and relocate as easily as people can in London, then we can safely judge the Northern Powerhouse project to be a failure. That is the key. How do you relocate people? How do you enable them to get to work which suits their skill set? In the early part of the recession, in the early part of the recovery, I beg your pardon, we saw very strong employment growth. But a lot of people I was talking to, particularly when we used to talk to our MPs in London, they would say, you're giving us a lot of very positive data, but my constituents are coming to me saying there is still problems. I cannot gain work. I cannot enter. And this is a skills and geography issue. It's very easy for us at a macro level to talk about, manufacturing plant in Borough A has closed, 500 people made redundant, but digital social media skills and companies are opening up in Salford Quays, and we've created 700 new jobs. At the macro level, that's great. We're plus 200. But it's very hard to see how you can help those people from Borough A in skill set B to move to Borough C with skill set D. That's the challenge. So then this is where I said, all of this plays into policy stuff. This becomes transport policy. How do we help these people to move to somewhere different? That either, by commuting. It plays into housing policy in terms of actually can our population move to take advantage of jobs in another place? And thirdly, it plays into skills policy in terms of how do we help people who have been made redundant or are in declining areas to reskill and retrain in their adult life to take on a new skill to take them forth for the next 10 or 20 years. And sadly, the UK skills system Actually, the UK skills system has much to offer it. We have a higher education system which is globally renowned and we should be immensely proud of. But the way the country handles adult skills retraining is abysmal and has been for a very long time. And this is where we are working very closely here with the skills team and UK QES to try and come up with solutions to this. How do you help people to move and access the new jobs? So, still within the QES data, we also ask about how many of you have actually attempted to recruit and whether you were successful. And this plays back on a lot of the stuff I've talked about already, so I won't dwell here. Recruitment is the green line for both manufacturing on the left, services on the right. White is recruitment difficulties. Difficulties just keep getting harder, but more companies are trying to recruit. So 2/3 of all companies are attempting a new recruitment in each quarter at the moment. That's great news. But nearly 4 in 5 are having difficulty or be either difficulty filling or are unable to fill the positions. And again, that plays back directly into skills policy. How do you make sure that the current workforce who are employed, but particularly those who are not employed, can gain access to the right skills, the right training, the right support to enable them to move into all these jobs which firms are trying to create? Again, this is a micro issue. We must always separate the macro from the micro. The macro, everything's great. Growth is good, employment growth is good, labour market's looking healthy. A micro issue, in certain areas, certain towns, certain industries, certain sectors, there are some big problems. And this is, again, why we use a lot of this data to support the work we do with government. Out of the QES for a moment and just into some official data. This is the Office of National Statistics labour market data. Job seekers allowance figures here for the past 10 years. Left-hand side is what we call the workforce, 60 to 64, though obviously these days the growth in 65 and over working is immense. It's growing at about 10 or 11% a year at the moment. Over 65 is engaging with the workforce. But what I want to show you there is an interesting trend. So what you'll see first of all, the sheer scale, the rate of the decrease of people on job seekers allowance is phenomenal. It's never fallen this fast before, and the headline rate is now well below where it was in the pre-recession peak. But what I want you to particularly look at is what's happened to Greater Manchester's position against the wider region and the wider UK. And if my wonderful technology will work, I can show you that in somewhat more detail. Look at that. So Greater Manchester is the dotted green line there. Northwest white, UK. Sorry, wrong way around. The UK is the dotted green line. So we've always seen is Greater Manchester at the top in light green, UK below it. Greater Manchester has always had a higher unemployment rate, higher job seekers allowance rate than both the Northwest and the UK as a whole. But something has changed in the past 12 months. Now, 6 months ago, we would have said this was universal credit, the government's new benefits scheme, how it delivers a stream of benefits to people who are out of work and looking for work. Because up until April, all of those people who were translated onto universal credit, we were a pilot area, you see. Greater Manchester had 2 local authorities who were piloting, 2 job centre areas that were piloting universal credit. And they were starting with easy to get at cases, usually single men without dependents. That's where they were targeting that. Now, when those people who ordinarily would have gone and I'm out of work, I want to claim my benefits while I look for a new job, historically you'd have gone onto JSA, onto Job Seekers Allowance. In these trial areas, instead, you went onto universal credit. Now, when that was all rolled out, those people going onto universal credit were not counted in the JSA stats. At a national level, it doesn't matter because you had 2 pilot areas in GM, 1 pilot elsewhere. In the national figures, it was shifting it by 0.1 of a percentage point. In Greater Manchester, it was shifting it by sort of 0.5 percentage point, maybe a percentage point. For young people, and particularly for young men, it was shifting it by 50, 60%. Significant difference. But all that's changed. That is now rolled in. So that data you see includes all of the universal credit claimants. So there is a big shift that's going on. Now, what we can't tell, and the data is not yet available, is why it's falling so quickly. So we can't tell where people are coming. Where are they going from JSA? Are they going from JSA into work, or are they giving up? Because you have to be looking for a job to claim job seekers allowance. That's the critical point. So this might be people who've been looking for work for a long time, haven't been successful and have given up, disappeared either into the inactive market or the black market. It may be genuinely good news and we have made a significant impact on changing youth unemployment. There has been some very good work going on by the councils in Greater Manchester, more widely on how you engage with people through things like the work programme. They've had much, much higher success rates than the national average. So it could be that we're seeing some of that come through. We don't know, but at the moment it's an extremely good picture and we're happy to take it as that. On the right-hand side, we see the same thing, but for 16 to 24-year-olds, what we call youth unemployment. And again here, you'll see a significantly faster fall for both Greater Manchester and the North West than the UK average. The Greater Manchester number here can be shifted because of our very large university population. 100,000, 106,000 students across the universities in Greater Manchester means we have a big anomaly in all of our population data. We've got a much larger chunk of under 25s than anywhere else has. And because a very large share of those are in full-time education, they won't be looking at these sort of numbers. So that can skew it. But again, you can see in the data, something has changed in the past year. It's probably going to be another 6 months or so before we're able to really understand what's going on. But as I said, for the moment, we'll take that as being a great positive. Rather than looking at JSA, which is a subset of people who are unemployed, so if you're a job seekers allowance claimant, you have actually paid in enough already to be able to draw down JSA, variety of other criteria. If we look at wider unemployment, so definition of unemployment is I don't have a job but I want one. Actually, I'm going to skip forward a slide here. This is important, and almost nobody gets it. Because the problem for us economists is when we talk about unemployment, we mean something different to what almost everybody else thinks. This is the difficult bit. Unemployed does not mean I don't have a job. From my point of view and from this data's point of view, unemployed means I do not have a job, but I have been looking for one in the last 4 weeks, and I am available to start one in the next 2. Simple, isn't it? Right? That's unemployed. So we see the whole thing is very complicated. We don't see people as being employed or unemployed. We see them as being active or inactive in the economy. If you're inactive, you're not looking for work, you're a full-time student, you're a carer, you're retired, you're disenfranchised, then you're economically inactive. If you're economically active, you're either employed or unemployed but looking for work. And if you're in employment, you're either employed or self-employed. Clear? No, quite. It's just an important point because it means often people see unemployment and employment as two opposing sides of a set of scales, but they're not. They're actually both on the same side. So this is why you can have things, you can see both employment and unemployment rising at the same time, which is actually what's going on now. So employment is up nationally and here in Greater Manchester. Unemployment is up nationally here and here in Greater Manchester. What's causing that is employment is rising because people are getting jobs. That's easy. That's nice and straightforward. As far as we can tell from the data at this stage, unemployment is rising because people who sat on that inactive side, I am not looking for work for whatever reason, student, carer, retired, have now said, I still don't have a job, but I am now looking for work. That increases the unemployment numbers. Yeah? So I'm not looking for work, you're not unemployed. I still don't have a job, but I am looking for work, means you're now unemployed, and so you come onto the unemployment count. What appears to be driving that is women aged 25 to 34. That appears to be the big shift. So what we're seeing is women in that age bracket moving from being economically inactive, not looking for a job, moving into looking for a job. Now that's likely to be a big drive from the benefit change reforms. So we're seeing huge changes to working tax credit, to employment benefits, and we suspect that is starting to drive women who are either considering becoming parents or already parents into work to try and find additional money. Again, it's going to be a while before that plays through into the stats in enough detail for us to start to understand it, but at this stage it does look like Osborne's reforms to working tax credit only 3 months ago are already being picked up in terms of people's behaviour. So that's really interesting. The two things we've got here I just want to look at. This is unemployment rate broken down by age. So the green line on both charts, is unemployment for the whole, unemployment on the left, employment on the right for the whole workforce, 16 to 64-year-olds, and the white line is for youth unemployment, so those aged under 25. What I really want to show you here is look how different the scale of the change was between the overall workforce, which is the numbers we all reported, and the under 25s. Throughout the recession, it was the under 25s who bore the absolute brunt of unemployment. Yeah? So the workforce as a whole, only about 4 percentage points rise from pre-recession peak through to the worst point of the recession. We're seeing about a 12 percentage point rise for the under 25s. So that is where the focus of the issue for unemployment has been. And same thing on the right-hand side. This is employment, so don't forget these aren't the flips of each other directly. Employment overall fell about 4 percentage points for the workforce as a whole, but nearly 15 percentage points for the under 25s. Now, it's bouncing back up pretty quickly. It's still got a long way to go. Now, some of that for the employment, for the youth employment, is full-time education. So we are seeing significantly more young people staying in full-time education for longer. And that means a greater share of under 25s are economically inactive. That not only are they not in work, but they're not looking for work. Some might be looking for part-time work, and we can see those numbers. So that will take some of that decline from 2005 onwards, because you'll see that that's falling from 2006. So the rate is coming down before the recession starts to have an impact. But it is picking up strongly. So, as always, the labour market is a huge and complex beast, but the focus for any real concern and policy intervention is absolutely among the under 25s. Whether Osborne's announcement of the new living wage, the national living wage, tiering the over 25s at a higher rate than the rest of the workforce will help to address this. It might incentivise employers to hire people under 25 instead. Only time will tell, but we'll see how things go from there. You've seen that and understood it, so I'll ask you questions on that later. Okay, now, 0 hours contracts. I put this in because it's one of the biggest things I get asked about really in sort of passing in terms of what on earth is going on, and aren't all those businesses you represent beastly and evil and slave drivers? And the chart on the left might allow you to think that. Slight caveat on the data. There's 2 data points in 2014. The ONS has just started to change the way it represents this. So just to be disclosures with data, that trend line actually should be even steeper. The ONS has only recently started to look in detail, Office of National Statistics, in detail at 0 hours contracts. And there's not a long time series of data. Some of that back stuff is being recalculated from things they've already created, they've already done, and they're trying to derive from it. And they themselves in the release significantly caveat the accuracy of this. Most of the rise post-2011, from the ONS's point of view, and this is their declaration, is it is likely to be as affected by understanding of being on a 0 hours contract as it is the number of 0 hours contracts that are being enforced and delivered from employers. So that's a really important one. If I had come to you 5 years ago and asked if you were on a 0 hours, if you're registered with a temp agency, and I'd asked you if you were on a 0 hours contract, you'd have said, what the hell is one of those? If I ask you now if you're on a 0 hours contract, you know, you're aware of it, you've heard it, the media has pulled it all to the forefront of all our minds. So all this is survey data. This comes from the annual population survey, and 5,000 people are asked every month a variety of questions. And one is, are you employed on a 0 hours contract? It appears that historically many people probably were, but didn't know it, and therefore said no. Fundamentally, if you ever worked with a temp agency, you signed on, give me some work whenever you can, you were a 0 hours employee, but you would never have said so and never have considered yourself so. So a big share of the rise in 0 hours contracts that we've seen recently, and we cannot know what share, is probably an increased awareness of the employees. But more employers are undoubtedly using them more as well. Sadly, we just cannot at this stage know the increased share. But what is worth pointing out is the chart on the right and some of that detail. So if you're on a 0 hours contract, you're the data in green. If you're not on a 0 hours contract, you're the data in white. 4 key questions the ONS has asked. Do you want an additional job? Do you want a replacement job with longer hours? Would you like more hours in your current job? Or do you not want any more hours? Now, it's interesting. Yes, people on 0 hours contracts are more likely to say they would like more hours, but it's not a big share. 1 in 4. More people on 0 hours contracts would like a replacement job with longer hours, but it's only 1 in 10. And actually, people not on a 0 hours, and so conversely, if you do not want more hours, you're more likely to not be on a 0 hours contract if you say that. But nearly 2/3, 6 out of 10 people on 0 hours contracts do not want more hours. Now, the volume of people on 0 hours contracts is concentrated in the middle, in the 25 to 65 bracket, because that's where most people are. But as a share of working population, the greatest share of 0 hours contracts is in under 25s and over 65s. They are seen by around 2/3. The Recruitment and Employment Confederation did a big survey on this last year. About 2/3 of people on a 0 hours contract do not want a permanent contract with fixed hours. They want the flexibility. They might be a student trying to work around lectures. They might be a retired person who's looking for an additional bit of money to top up pension. So we must be careful, and we spoke to government very clearly about this when they consulted last year, is do not abolish a 0 hours contract. Yes, there are some hair-raising practices from a very small minority of employers who are behaving pretty awfully. But actually don't abolish them. So yes, clamp down on exclusivity clauses, which say, I'm not going to guarantee to offer you any work, but I forbid you from looking for something with anybody else. Forbid that. We're very happy to see that. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of the recovery in employment, the strong recovery in employment since the recession, has been down to the sheer flexibility of the UK workforce. The labour market has been allowed to flex. People who want to take fewer hours have been able to. We've seen some actually very good behaviour, very good policies from the unions about looking to gradually shrink hours across the whole set, so actually you keep employment levels up but take less. It is that flexibility which has undoubtedly helped the UK recovery. So 0 hours contracts are a part. They are a small part, so about 2% of the workforce in the UK are on them. And about 2/3 of those are happy with it. So be careful chasing very, very noisy policy, for it's a very, very small subset. Now, at the micro level, that subset is important, because we must always remember that 0.6% of the workforce is not just a statistic, but it is several 100,000 people. But target the issues there. Don't try to do a blanket ban. That's me off my soapbox. Back to the QES data. We're just on the back end now, so we'll just about 5 more minutes, and we'll take some questions. We asked about confidence, your expectations across industries for turnover and profitability. We are close to record highs on all of that. And what's interesting here actually is if you do the split by, if you extract construction from this broad manufacturing figure, the manufacturing figure is slightly down, but still very, very high, way above long-term trends. So even though you're seeing that decrease in demand in the manufacturing sector at the moment, that slight weakening of growth, employment intentions are still holding up, recruitment is still holding up, and confidence for the next 12 months is holding up. So that's why I say, you know, we've got concerns around manufacturing, but we are not worried. It's something to watch, but for now, the outcome is looking good, and the service sector, as I've said before, is booming. Investment. 2 separate things we look at here. One is capital plant on the left-hand side, what we call physical productive capacity, and on the right-hand side, investment in staff. Investment in plant is moving quite nicely. Big drop from the service sector this quarter, not really clear what that is. That's going to be definitely have a look at next quarter's data and see if we can start to look at trends. But manufacturing investment is very good. Earlier on, I talked about some of the confusion between a consumer-led recovery and an investment-led recovery, and some of that concern. And lots of people even now are still issuing press releases saying it's a nightmare, consumer spending is too high, we have to rebalance our economy to exports and investment and all of that kind of stuff. Investment follows demand. This is a key thing. This is Economics 101. You cannot expect an investment-led recovery, because who here would invest in productive capacity for their business without sight of consumer spending at the end of it? I'm going to invest £1 million in a widget-making machine, even though I can't see anybody who wants to buy more widgets. It doesn't work that way. The consumer demand comes first, and investment will then follow. We were saying that 3 years ago, thanks to the data you give us, and the chart now lies it out. 2013, remember from those earlier charts, Q1 2013 is when demand suddenly started to return in the UK economy. Look where the investment started to pick up, just 6 months after that. It's exactly what we expect. investment lags demand by about 6 to 12 months. Right-hand chart is investment in people, so how much money is being spent, how much time is being spent investing in skills and training, either of your additional workforce or of anyone you are hiring. And with the labour market shrinking, tightening, available labour pool shrinking, not surprisingly, that is back where we were pre-recession. That's a good sign. Historically, and certainly in comparison with other countries, it is still low. UK business has been decreasing the amount it spends on human capital, on training and the skills of its workforce, pretty much year on year for about 40 years. If you compare us to other OECD nations, other developed countries, the amount we spend on developing our staff is fairly pitiful. And that will certainly be playing into a lot of the recruitment problems a lot of you are telling us about. We're doing some interesting work with the construction sector at the moment on looking at how they train, whose responsibility is it to train. Early data from that, you ask a huge swathe of companies whose responsibility is it to train. Is it the big guys, the small guys, chambers, colleges? If you ask all of those people, about 3/4 basically say somebody else. British business is managing a very, very good buck-passing exercise about who should look after the future profitability of their firms. Yes, government has a key requirement to deliver a broadly rounded and useful person at the end of compulsory education. Whether they should provide someone who is particularly trained to every skill and requirement of your business, I would say is probably your problem. On that controversial note, I'll move on. Training is a big issue. Thankfully, investment is coming back, but comparable to other countries, we do not know enough of it. And if you're looking for an answer to the productivity crisis, I think there are at least 40 that are plausible. That's definitely one of them. Cash flow measures on the left-hand side are as positive as we have ever seen them. Not only are they above pre-recession peaks, they're still at record levels. The cash flow index on the QES right back to 1989, the long-run average is negative. Companies are always worried about cash flow. Big pickup. We know from a lot of other data that companies have been increasing their own cash piles as well over the past 5 years, fearful of whether they could get access to capital from the banks. And so we're looking at that, and almost certainly that strong cash flow over the last sort of year or so is helping the investment spend that we've also seen. On the right-hand side, intentions to increase prices. The inflationary environment remains extremely weak. Overall CPI inflation, of course, is at 0 at the moment. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. But from your point of view, from what you're telling us, prices aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Diving within that, not only do we ask about your pricing intentions, your output prices, we also ask about what are your input pressures. Not surprisingly, in the manufacturing sector, raw materials has been shrinking back solidly for the last 5-6 years or so. Global commodity prices continue to ease. Oil is a big one in that. Oil's still trading sub $50 a barrel this morning, 60% down on the year. Pay settlements are sort of starting to nudge up. The big one for us is going to be looking around Q1, Q2 next year with the living wage increases and the minimum wage increases from there. We expect we'll see that pick up from there. But certainly pay settlements look to be on the move and raw materials an ever-declining issue. Official data on prices. Left-hand side is your CPI index, the main index of inflation in the UK. Green line shows you where that is. Prices are going nowhere at the moment. Mostly driven by oil. That's been the big one. Some very good food harvests as well this year, so food prices are down. The white line on the left-hand side is what we call core inflation. So we take the volatiles out of it. So if you strip away energy, food, alcohol and tobacco, you'll see there's a current of underlying inflation which is still there, about 1%. This gets to the core of the issue about the hawks on the Monetary Policy Committee, about when do interest rates of the Bank of England begin to move. So you have people like Andrew Sentance, like McCafferty at the moment, who are saying, you know, you should be starting to move now on interest rates because inflation could come very, very quickly. Now, the problem for interest rates is they take between 18 and 24 months to get into the economy properly. To be fully priced in takes nearly 2 years. So usually the line for bank economists is if you wait until you see you could need it, you've missed it. And that's why some of those people are saying, actually, look, core inflation, take the volatiles away, is at 1%. It's only energy and oil that's keeping inflation down so low. And the other impact of that, if you look at the chart on the right, is inflation split down between goods and services. So services inflation, right-hand index, running at just over 2%, 2.5% at the moment. And 2.5% to 3% is where services inflation has been in the UK for 40 years. It has barely moved. It moves around occasionally. It's a long-run average. The weak inflation we are seeing now is caused by imports. It is where we are bringing our goods from. Every time you buy a TV, an iPhone, anything, it is cheaper this year than it was last year. And it is that is keeping our inflation down. We are importing deflation. Domestically, inflation is relatively strong. Core inflation is slightly below Bank of England target. This is going to be the topic of debate for the Bank of England over the next few months. At what point, wages are now rising nearly 4%, at what point do we say, actually, we can see inflation picking up in the next 12 to 18 months and we need to act? Inflation will take a leap later this year. Once the oil price fall of early this year falls out of the annual comparison, almost a percentage point will go straight onto the inflation rate. So we will see 1% by the end of this year, 2% by the end of 2016 is where we're expecting. To dive into that goods data more deeply, this is the Office of National Statistics producer prices, left-hand side input prices. You want to know where all that imported deflation is coming? There you go. Prices down nearly 30% in the past 3 years in terms of inputs, and that is keeping the head on output prices there on the right-hand side, flat for 4 years. So again, it is imports that are causing our weak deflation. It is raw materials coming from abroad that is keeping the prices down. Average weekly earnings, we touched on that a little earlier on. Only to say, I said the whole economy is rising about 3.7% in the latest data. And that's being held back by the public sector. The left-hand chart there, the dotted green line is public sector earnings, 1% pay cap across much, but not all of the public sector at the moment. Pay freezes in place in other parts is keeping that down, but the private sector is moving on at a pace, about 4.4% in the latest data for private sector pay. And if you disaggregate by industry there on the right-hand side, manufacturing about 2%, services and construction on average around the 4% mark now. What is going on? What are the external factors on your business that are affecting you more this quarter than last quarter? Predominantly in there, the blue line is competition. Now, I can't really give you a long-run series on this because the chart becomes totally illegible. But post-recovery, competition has leapt as being the single most important issue for business. That's actually probably a very healthy thing. That would certainly mean you're all having to work a lot harder to keep those margins and make those sales, but undoubtedly good, strong competition is a good thing. Exchange rates, always more important for the manufacturing sector than for services, as I talked about. Strong pound at the moment, about 153 against the dollar this morning, 137 against the euro. Strong by short-term averages, and short-term trends, but actually about where you'd expect them to be. You say in the long run, they're probably price parity. They're probably about where you'd expect them to be. And certainly we don't expect them going anywhere soon until the first bank rate comes along. When the Bank of England decides to move interest rates, we can expect a fairly decent spike in sterling at that point. Otherwise, other issues are relatively benign. Business rates has always been the one bobbling along in second or third place. We're working very close with Treasury at the moment on the business rates review that's going through. There's some interesting conversations we're having with them, but we're expecting a report by the end of the year, and I'll tell you all the news about that nearer the time. But basically, that is the data. That's what we do with it. In summary, we know the Greater Manchester economy is doing well. We know we are growing more quickly than the UK on average. We are rather more optimistic than a lot of forecasters out there. We're going for 2.7, 2.8% for this year. That's because of construction, primarily. The ONS data is extremely weak, and we do not see that anywhere in the industry. They're wrestling with a new data model on how they seasonally adjust construction data, and it is being very, very heavily revised. So for now, we will go bullish on forecasts, 2.7, 2.8, mostly driven by a very strong services sector and a very healthily recovering construction sector. Manufacturing is facing some headwinds. We don't yet know what they are, but we will hope to know more over the next 3 or 6 months. And recruitment and skills is undoubtedly going to be the issue for business as you wrestle with an ever-decreasing pool of available labour. Thank you very much, everybody.
we've got time for some questions. We've actually had one from Twitter from Michael Dow from Barker ABI, and he's asking the question: what, in your opinion, is driving the increase in tourism in Greater Manchester?
I think we're a wonderful place. No, just turn that. I know Michael well. Tourism's an interesting one. I mean, undoubtedly, we talk about brand Manchester a lot. So, you know, how does that resonate not only within the UK but around the world? Football, without a doubt, sits at the heart of it. The brands of United and City play very well across the world. The history of Manchester, I think we often underplay the whole sort of, you know, first industrial city in the world. We're very used to it here because we're surrounded by it, but it's an enormous draw for people, particularly from emerging markets, to come and see the history. You know, we underestimate. The Industrial Revolution was born here. Nuclear science was born here. The computer was born here. This is what we do. We're an incredibly creative city. So it's the one thing we always talk about with bodies like Marketing Manchester. You know, it is brand Manchester. Sorry? Conferences has been a huge... I mean, whoever it was within the City Council who decided to take over the old Exchange Centre, the Exchange Railway Station, and turn that into what was GMX, is now Manchester Central, was a foresighted genius, really. No other city has anything of that capacity that close to the city centre. That's the issue. Other places, you know, you can go down to, what's that larger one, the Docklands. You know, they're huge sites, but they're swine to get to. The fact you can just hop off here at the city centre railway stations and walk down is immense. So large venues, the hotel system that has grown to be able to facilitate that. Good transport connectivity on the whole, though we'd like to see that improve. But yeah, it's a wide-ranging thing.
Okay, thank you. Anybody got any questions? Christian, off the back of the presentation, a couple of hands up. Rich will go.
Well, first I'd just like to compliment you on your set of data, Christian. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
I think I've learned an awful lot from that, particularly I like the fact that construction and extraction has been sort of separated from manufacturing. That gives me a much clearer picture. But the question really was on something about employment. I've been doing the QES now for many years, and every quarter I was tick the box to say, are you employing people? And there are two reasons for that. One, which you touched on. One is expansion, and the other is replacing people who've left. So is there some value in perhaps on the XQS splitting that up to say, well, are you increasing the number of people you're employing, or are you replacing people who are retiring?
Thanks. You know, for the benefit of the recorder. Richard very kindly just commented on splitting out construction and manufacturing data just to help. But the question was around employment, and how we look at whether it's replacement of existing stock of employees as against adding to your workforce. The difficulty for us with the QES is one of its powerful things I touched on at the beginning is this uninterrupted time series of data for nearly 30 years. And so what we don't really want to do is play around directly with those questions. The comparability of that data is hugely important to us. The other joy for us in that actually is the official data from the ONS backs up a lot of that. So we get very accurate net employment changes by industry, by local authority. So we can actually see net employment within manufacturing, within Greater Manchester, and indeed for you, even within Bury. We can see that in the official data. It's lagged by about 6 months, which is the unhelpful part, but we can see it. I think within manufacturing it's interesting because on the whole manufacturing employment continues to decline despite large-scale recruitment. And you said this interesting thing that you've got an ageing workforce which is dropping off at the top, which needs replacing at the bottom, but usually doesn't need replacing with the same number of people. Yeah, since the recession in Greater Manchester, we talk about productivity crisis, you know, and everybody's employing too many people and not doing enough with them. Since 2008, manufacturing output has, in Greater Manchester, dropped by about 10–15%, but employment dropped by 25%. So it's a great example of actually doing much more with less. You know, it's the unsung bit about manufacturing as a whole. So people talk about we don't make anything anymore. You know, manufacturing's gone in this country. If you look at manufacturing on the long run data from sort of the 1940s, the recession, the deindustrialisation and recessions of the 80s, and the current recession and recovery for that sector since 2008 appear as tiny blips on a massive, massive growth chart. Manufacturing is a massive growth sector. we're still stunted slightly from the recession, but on the whole, the sector produces more every year than it did the year before. Its success story, and the flip side, is it doesn't need the people. It is the most efficient, most transformative, most productive sector in the UK economy. We now produce, what, twice the output we did 30 years ago, with something like 20% of the population of the employment we needed. So it's a phenomenally transformative sector, and it is hard. And one of the things I'm going to look to do for the Q4 presentation actually is dive much more deeply into the labour market data and just try to help you understand some of that stuff, because the headline numbers are very beguiling as to what's actually going on underneath. I don't know if that answers your question, Richard. But
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. John. Yeah.
Christian, you made a brief reference to the scandal engulfing VW for that. And while that clearly could have a knock-on effect on the motor industry, is there any historical evidence that a sort of corporate scandal like that, that engulfs one section of the economy, could actually spread to other sections in terms of confidence in the economy?
yeah, so has the minor problems VW is going through at the moment, are there precedents for one company within one sector spreading out into the rest? I'd be tempted to say Northern Rock and Lehman Brothers are probably the two single biggest examples of something going very badly wrong. You could probably wind slightly back further as well to things like Enron in the early 2000s, was that late 90s. It's an interesting one. I've been following this quite closely and reading some articles in the FT this morning on the way in. I mean, people are genuinely concerned about whether this is going to end up with a government bailout of VW from the German government. It has a huge debt pile, runs about €70 billion debt, which needs refinancing. The spreads on the bonds to fund that have tripled in the past week. And there is some genuine concern about whether, some commentators are talking about whether this may be the end of VW. This is kind of your sort of General Motors moment. They're recalling basically every car they've ever built because of ignition difficulties over the last year or two. So it's rare that one company can knock out an entire industry. And of course, the European car market is phenomenally driven by here, where again, one of our, a big chunk of our productive manufacturing sector is in car assembly at plants across the UK, and we export a lot to Europe. It looks this morning as if BMW are being dragged into it. There's some concerns from within the wider German market. And certainly, there's already concern that this issue was raised to the UK regulators last year, and it looks like nothing was done on it then, and it's only when the US has got involved that the UK is starting to ask for tighter regulation. So it's not clear. I mean, government policy here on diesel cars has been actually pro-diesel for the past 10 years because it emits less CO2. So we saw, cheaper pricing of diesel sort of a decade ago to try and encourage that. Diesel is a very, very tiny part of the American market. 0.3% of cars in the US are diesel, and this is having ructions there. 55% of new cars in the UK are diesel. So the potential effect here is much, much larger.
I think the other thing on that is, of course, is that a lot of vehicle excise duty is also based on your emissions as well. So it's not just the consumer that could turn around and say, hang on a minute, it's also the Treasury, etc. So there's massive ramifications around all this.
Taxable benefits.
Yep.
Taxable benefit. Well, that's something for another day. Watch this space. Got time for a couple more questions, gentlemen. We've got two more.
With the headwinds in manufacturing you talk about and the problems of labour supply, is now the right time to be considering an EU exit?
Manufacturing headwinds and labour supply problems, is this a time to consider leaving the EU? You say no, and you by the broader membership. For those of you who listened to the news this morning, you'll have heard, if you listen to the Day programme or read the papers, British Chamber of Commerce published its survey data that we did just before the QES period, actually, on businesses' intentions around the EU. That's fairly conclusive. It says exactly what you've been saying to us in local surveys for the past 2 or 3 years. About 2/3 of you want to stay in. About half of those who say they want to stay in have absolutely no intention of changing their mind, no matter what Cameron comes back with in terms of renegotiation package. But that does mean, those sound positive figures and they're in the majority, but it does mean that half of the business community is open to exit. Chance to have a look at the press articles today is 50% of businesses polled, chamber membership, so this is everything from sole traders to PLCs, every sector included. 50% say that exit would either be neutral or positive to their business. Only 45% say it would be actively negative. Now that goes, and the Times ran on this particularly, goes everything against everything the CBI has been saying, but you know, CBI says what the CBI says. Its membership is a much tighter group of people than the chamber network. I'm not going to answer this question from a personal point of view because that would just be a nightmare. From the evidence that all you are giving us, it's broadly a case of we'd rather be in than out, but in on the status quo is not our ideal. The survey data is clear that you, the business community, back Cameron. The perfect outcome is in with reforms. But actually, most of you say, even if he comes back on the status quo, if you're going to hold a gun to Adam and vote tomorrow, we'd vote to stay in. And I don't think that's necessarily, and this is where the debate gets confusing and complex, it's not necessarily about the obvious positives of the EU. It's about the uncertainty of the negatives if we were to leave. So, in the long run, no change in government relations makes any major difference over the long run. The issue with regulatory changes, with border changes, with trade changes, is a massive impact in the short term. If the UK were to leave the EU, in a year or two's time, would everything look broadly it does now? Would UK business be functioning as it does now? Actually, the answer is probably yes. EU countries trade as much with us, actually more. They export to us more than we import from them, more than we export to them. No, but the short-term impact could be fierce, and it's highly unknown, and that appears to be why there's still this chunk in the middle who are sort of slightly edgy about going.
We're going to be picking that up at our autumn assembly on the 16th of October, around that and a couple of other issues as well. Just conscious of time, just got a couple of more questions. We'll take those on the back of each other and we'll
sure.
Wrap up after those. So, gentlemen here. Yeah.
Christian, just one question. You mentioned about productivity increases, more being done with less people. Out of interest, would your survey include things like robotics? Because I have a passion for aviation, and I know in people like Boeing, for example, that they're using a lot more robotics to produce certain components of aircraft manufacture. So is that something that you could see as developing? Would that be involved in that? Because we're in a digitised age, and we're at the point where machines are replacing more men.
Yeah, our productivity increase is being driven by robotics, increased use of machines. Undoubtedly, yes. The data doesn't go into that level of detail, and as far as I'm aware, none of the official data goes to that level. But there is some interesting research from particular industries. So you mentioned aerospace. Actually, the BBC have been doing a big run of programs on the Today program recently from Boeing's factory in Washington State, where they're looking to constantly industrialise. And essentially, we know that's what's going on. That is what's happening in manufacturing. It's not about people becoming more productive. It's people becoming more productive and being enabled to be more productive because of machinery. We're seeing it increasingly in the service sector. We talk about an hourglass economy, so actually, there's lots of the manual face-to-face jobs that can't really be automated very easily. Receptionists, how do you automate hairdressing? That's not an easy one. But there is that bit of the middle. You're seeing some aspects of old secretarial. You're seeing some aspects of, for me, data analytics. I mean, the time that is saved for me with all the analytics service and things we have here to do this is immense. That's essentially the same thing. It's robotic stuff. We script the analytics in code rather than chew a pencil and work on spreadsheets anymore. So the survey itself doesn't pick it up, but undoubtedly it's an ever-increasing issue, and it's not going to slow down.
That could also be part of this work we're doing around the engineering manufacturing sector going forward, looking at some of the key issues in that as well. Do get that greater automation going forward. Last question for...
Yeah, very quickly, I'm feeling very guilty because I drive a 2-litre Skoda with the EA189 engine in it. It's only CO2 emissions that affect you. That's not the...
It is. That's right.
We've gone very, very briefly over the Northern Powerhouse.
Yeah.
Today. Is that because since the election and the fact that they're not going to notify the railway leads it's not such a big subject. If it is still a big subject, how on earth are we going to turn London-centric policies around to put the kind of investment in this area that they're putting into the Crossrail project and on the modern trains you get on in London compared to the pacer units I have to ride into from Rochdale?
Yeah. Yeah, what is the Northern Powerhouse, and is anything happening with it? I think I stressed kind of fairly early on that for us, if the connectivity and the rail infrastructure and the ability to move people around in the north is not delivered, then the Northern Powerhouse will fail. I am unanimous on that, as Mrs. Slocum might have said. It's a big issue. I mean, partly we're fairly pragmatic about the DfT's decision to pause, and I stress that word, pause electrification. It's a massive disappointment. The east-west connectivity in the north of England is abysmal. Sadly, I routinely commute to Leeds. Well, in fact, I live on the way to Leeds and routinely commute to Leeds and Liverpool for other things. And the time it takes to get across such small distances is depressingly slow. The rolling stock is awful. That's my regular commute. To be fair to the DfT, Network Rail's handling of electrification so far over the last 2-3 years, they're currently wiring London Paddington to Bristol. They've just completed Liverpool to Manchester via St Helens. They've just completed Liverpool to Wigan. It's all been between 2 and 3 times over budget. It's all been late. You couldn't, in all honesty, expect the DfT to press ahead while Network Rail is cataclysmically failing so significantly. I use those strong words in some comfort because that's pretty much what Network Rail itself acknowledged, not only recently after the announcement, but actually was talking about it before. It's acknowledged its supply chain is not ready. There is not the human capacity to deliver the electrification needed. They have bought 2 shiny new electrification trains for the Great Western, which were supposed to be sinking 250 piles a night, and they're achieving 6 or 7. The whole thing's been a bit of a nightmare. But this is a very good example about why government should be careful about how it programmes capital expenditure programmes. When you're thinking about how you deliver houses, when you're thinking about how you deliver infrastructure, the supply chain takes years and years to wind itself up to speed, capability and competence to deliver. But it will shed that capability and competence in a trice if the forward demand goes. So, you know, the last major electrification project we did in the UK was the East Coast in the 1980s. I remember it well. We've done nothing since then. You know, Osborne has come along with some very good announcements about let's improve Transpennine, we were going to do a bit of electrification, let's do lots, let's throw the Great Western in, let's do Transpennine, let's do Windermere, let's do Blackpool, let's do Midland Main Line. And within the, you know, constrained spending, Network Rail runs on 5-year budget cycles. All of this stuff was kind of shoehorned into the current control period. And Network Rail has neither had the budget nor the manpower to be able to deliver. Now, we expect the Transpennine stuff will just roll forward to what we call CP6, 2019 to 2024 spending. It will probably all be delivered then. It's disappointing it's late. The big one for us is just keep pressing on. You know, the Network Rail restructure will be announced later this year, that Peter Hendy's doing. Hopefully that will help out. But we have to keep pressing on this. It's the one thing we're trying to get through to government. Northern Powerhouse is a brand that is being stretched beyond all credibility. It is Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds and Sheffield and Newcastle and a bit of Cumbria and some of Birmingham. And it's about transport and labour market and culture and it's what is it? You couldn't, if you're in a business, you couldn't sell this to anybody because it's too fuzzy. All we say is it is about enabling a single labour market of people, goods and services to shift around the north of England as efficiently as they can in London. Deliver that and all your other hopes and dreams will follow naturally. Business will go where the investment is and they will drive. But if you don't deliver that connectivity, it's doomed.
I'm finishing on. just try and raise the spirits.
Go on, turn them around.
I was just going to say, no, it is a genuinely serious problem, and if you read anything that we put out through our communication channels, if you read Clive's column in 53 Degrees, what Christian's saying there is nothing that we've not said beforehand. What we need, though, is to make sure we can carry on saying it to the right people, so that when those decisions are being made for the right reasons, and they're going to have the right impact on the business, on you, on us, together in Greater Manchester. across the north of England. That draws to a conclusion our meeting this morning. I thought it's been absolutely superb. Great range of questions, fantastic information and data and research that Chris has produced there, as well as showing us some more of the background information that sits behind some of this stuff as well. So it's been absolutely superb. Just want to mention a couple of key dates coming up. I've mentioned already, I will get the month right this time. Our AGM and Autumn Assembly is on the 16th of October. Please look out on the brief, the events brief, for details around that. We will be using that as an opportunity to discuss some of these policy issues in a lot more detail. We're going to be looking at the EU, we're going to be looking at energy, we're also going to be looking at skills and also around the living wage, stroke the minimum wage as well. We're doing a lot of work on those at present. The next QES fieldwork period soon be with us, 9th of November to the 2nd of December as well. That's Q4, that's the final survey of the year, and our next quarter's economic breakfast is here on Friday the 18th of December. Pre-Christmas treat for everyone. There's just one other thing I just want to mention as well. There's a week to go on one of the issues and one of the announcements that came out of the summer budget from the Chancellor was around the idea of an apprenticeship levy, and there is a consultation at present around that being run by government, and we're looking for some businesses that will be prepared to answer some questions on that. If you are interested at all in taking part in that, can you please come and let me have your details, or Christian or one of the other members of staff here at the Chamber. We just want to get some views from businesses on that particular issue, because it is quite important and is being trailed as a potential solution to some of the issues that people are experiencing around skills, and we just need your views on some of that as well. So that's just a little plea there as well. Please feel free to make full use of the members' lounge unless you've really got to dash back to work or wherever it is you're going to next. There's tea, coffee, we've got Wi-Fi on in there as well. And if you are a Chamber member and you ever pass and you fancy popping in, please do so. It's not just for events or anything. That's open every single day of the week for Chamber members to come, meet other members, but also make use of the facilities here. I'd just like to thank Christian once again for a fantastic presentation this morning, and also like to thank you as well for turning up, giving up your time, and if this is really of interest to you, please make sure you fill out your next QES and also tell other people about it as well. Don't keep it to yourself. We don't want it to be called the best kept secret. We need to be telling as many businesses as possible about the survey, about the Chamber of Commerce, and what we can do for you as businesses in Greater Manchester. Thank you very much.
Really fantastic presentation.
Good, thank you very much. That's really kind. Thanks. Nice to see you. Cheers.
I'm happy to do that stuff on the apprentices.
It's right.